My brother drowned at age 8, but yesterday he knocked on my door as a 30-year-old stranger with my brother's memories. The man standing on my porch had Daniel's eyes. Not similar eyes, not eyes that reminded me of my dead brother. Daniel's exact eyes, down to the small brown fleck in the left iris that made it look like someone had splattered paint on green glass. I stood frozen in the doorway of my Seattle apartment while rain drummed against the awning above us. He was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and he smiled at me with a trembling uncertainty that made my chest constrict. "Ryan," he said quietly, and my name in his mouth sounded wrong and right simultaneously. "I know this is impossible. I know what you think happened 22 years ago, but I need you to listen to me for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. Then if you want to call the police or slam the door, I'll understand." I should have done both those things immediately. Instead, I stepped back and let him inside. He sat on my couch, leaving wet marks on the cushions, and I remained standing because sitting felt like acceptance of something my brain refused to process. Daniel drowned on July 19th, 2003, at Silver Lake during our family camping trip. I was 12 years old. I watched the rescue divers pull his small body from the water after 6 hours of searching. I stood beside my parents at his funeral 3 days later, while they lowered a white casket into the ground. My mother never fully recovered. My father became a ghost who lived in our house but existed somewhere else entirely. And now this stranger sat in my living room with Daniel's eyes and said, "You gave me that scar." He pointed to a small white line above his left eyebrow. "Summer before the lake. I took your skateboard without asking and tried to ride it down the driveway. Wiped out on the concrete. You carried me inside and told Mom I fell off my bike so I wouldn't get in trouble for taking your stuff. You held my hand while she cleaned the cut, and you kept saying it would be fine, it would heal. Nobody would even notice. But you noticed. You always checked it afterward to make sure it was healing right." That memory existed in a locked room in my mind that I never opened. Nobody knew about the skateboard lie except Daniel and me. Not my parents, not my friends. It was one of dozens of small conspiracies between brothers that died with him. I sat down slowly on the chair across from the couch. "Who are you?" My voice came out hoarse. "How do you know that?" He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together. "My name is Daniel Archer. I was born October 11th, 1995. My brother Ryan is 4 years older than me. My mom made the best chocolate chip cookies, but she always burned the edges slightly and pretended it was intentional. My dad coached Little League and drove a blue Chevy truck with a dent in the rear bumper from backing into a pole at the grocery store. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit, who was scared of thunderstorms and would hide under my bed. And on July 19th, 2003, I didn't drown at Silver Lake. Someone pulled me out of the water and took me away. I've spent 22 years trying to remember enough to find my way home. I called my mother. My hands shook while I dialed, and the stranger who claimed to be Daniel watched me with patient intensity. She answered on the 4th ring with her careful voice, the one she used when she wasn't sure whether to be worried or annoyed. "Ryan? It's late. Is everything okay?" I looked at the man on my couch. "Mom, do you remember anything unusual about the day Daniel died? Anything that didn't make sense?" The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she said very quietly, "Why are you asking me this?" I told her someone had come to my apartment claiming to be Daniel. I expected her to tell me it was impossible, to warn me about con artists or delusional people. Instead, she said, "What does he look like?" In a voice I had never heard her use before. It was the voice of someone who had been expecting this phone call for 22 years. She arrived 40 minutes later with my father. I hadn't asked him to come. I hadn't known she would bring him. They stood in my living room staring at the stranger with expressions I couldn't interpret. My mother's face had gone completely white. My father looked like he might vomit or pass out. Daniel stood up slowly from the couch and said, "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad." My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a scream. My father caught her arm when her knees buckled. "It's not possible," my father said, but he wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at Daniel with something that resembled terror. They told us he was dead. They showed us his body. We buried him. Daniel shook his head. You buried someone. I don't know who, but it wasn't me. I woke up in a hospital in Vancouver 3 days after the lake. A woman named Catherine Ward was sitting beside my bed. She told me there had been an accident, that my parents had died, that she was my aunt and I would be living with her now. I believed her because I was 8 years old and my head hurt, and I couldn't remember anything before waking up in that hospital bed. She called me Thomas. For 14 years she called me Thomas Ward, and I didn't know any different. Then what happened? I heard myself ask. My parents still hadn't moved from their positions near the door. Daniel ran his hand through his wet hair. When I turned 22, I started having dreams. Fragments of memories that didn't fit Catherine's stories about my childhood. A golden retriever, a blue truck, a brother who wasn't in any of the photos Catherine kept. I confronted her about it. She had a stroke 2 days later and died in the hospital before she could explain anything. But I found documents in her house, birth certificates, medical records, newspaper clippings about a drowning at Silver Lake, and photos. Dozens of photos of a family she claimed didn't exist, of me as a small child with people she said weren't my parents, with a brother she said I never had. He pulled a worn envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to my mother. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photographs I recognized. Daniel's school picture from 2nd grade, a shot of us building sandcastles at the beach. Our family Christmas card from 2002. My mother dropped the envelope, and the photos scattered across the floor. My father picked up one of the photos, the Christmas card with all 4 of us wearing matching red sweaters that we had hated. Where did you get these? His voice was barely audible. Daniel met his eyes. From the woman who raised me, from Catherine Ward, the woman who told me for 14 years that my name was Thomas and my parents were dead. Do you know who she was? My father's face did something complicated. He looked at my mother. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. We should sit down, my father said finally. This is going to take a while to explain. Daniel's expression hardened. I've waited 22 years for an explanation. Start talking. My father sat down heavily in the chair I had vacated. My mother remained standing with her arms wrapped around herself like she was physically holding herself together. Catherine Ward was your mother's sister, my father said. Your aunt, not by blood, by marriage. She married your mother's brother Kenneth when you were 5 years old. Kenneth died 6 months before the camping trip, my mother said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Car accident on Highway 5. Catherine was devastated. They never had children. Kenneth was her entire world. Daniel's jaw tightened. So she decided to steal someone else's child? My mother's composure cracked. We didn't know. You have to understand, we didn't know. We thought you were dead. The police found your body in the lake. They made us identify you. There was a funeral. We mourned you for 22 years. She was crying now, harsh sobs that shook her shoulders. They showed us a body, my father said. But we only saw the face for a moment before they covered it again. They said the water damage was extensive, that we shouldn't remember you that way. We were in shock. We weren't thinking clearly. And the body was about the right size, the right age, the right hair color. Daniel stood up abruptly. What are you saying? That some other child died and they just decided it was me? That nobody bothered to verify? I had been silent throughout this exchange, trying to process information that kept contradicting itself. Who identified the body first? I asked. Before you got there, who found him and said it was Daniel? My parents looked at each other. The camp counselor, my mother said slowly. Brian Shepard. He was the one supervising the swimming area. He's the one who reported Daniel missing. He's the one who was there when the divers brought up the body. He told them it was Daniel before we even arrived at the lake. The name triggered something in my memory. Brian Shepard. Wasn't he Catherine's boyfriend at one point, before she married Kenneth? My mother's face went from white to gray. Oh God. Oh my God. Yes, they dated for 2 years before she met Kenneth. He was at their wedding. He was at Kenneth's funeral. Catherine introduced them when she first joined the family. Daniel's hands had curled into fists. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Your sister-in-law's ex-boyfriend was the counselor supervising me when I supposedly drowned. He was the one who identified a body that wasn't actually me. and somehow I ended up in Canada with your sister-in-law who had just lost her husband and was desperate for a child. And you think this is all coincidence? My father stood up. His face had gone from shocked to something harder, something angry. We need to call the police, right now. If what you're saying is true, if this was planned, then Catherine and Brian committed kidnapping and murder. They killed some other child and let us think it was Daniel. They let us bury someone else's son. I pulled out my phone, but Daniel put his hand on my arm. Wait. Before we call anyone, I need to know something. The documents I found in Catherine's house weren't just photos and birth certificates. There were bank statements, wire transfers, large amounts of money changing hands in the months before the drowning. $50,000 deposited into Catherine's account 2 weeks before the camping trip, another $30,000 3 days after. The transfers came from an account registered to Silver Lake Youth Camp. I need to know if this was just about Catherine wanting a child, or if there was something bigger happening at that camp. The question hung in the air like smoke. My mother sat down on the couch where Daniel had been sitting. There were other disappearances, she said quietly. I didn't remember until just now, but after Daniel died, I started researching the camp. I needed to understand what happened, how they could have been so careless. I found articles about 3 other children who had gone missing from camps in Washington and Oregon over the previous 5 years. Different camps, different circumstances, but all of them near water, all of them supervised by staff who claimed the children had drowned or wandered off. Only one body was ever recovered. She looked up at Daniel. I told your father about it. I wanted to contact the other families to see if there were patterns, but the police told me I was looking for connections that weren't there. They said I was trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. Eventually, I stopped looking because I couldn't survive the searching. I had to accept that you were gone, or I would have lost my mind completely. Daniel's expression shifted from anger to something colder. 3 other children. You're saying there might have been an organized trafficking operation using summer camps as hunting grounds. It wasn't a question. He pulled out his phone and showed us a photograph of a document. It was a ledger of some kind, columns of names and dates and amounts. I found this in a locked box under Catherine's bed. Most of the names mean nothing to me, but 3 of them match missing children from camp disappearances. And look at the amounts listed beside their names. 60,000, 75,000, 80,000. Someone was paying for these children. Catherine didn't take me because she was grieving and desperate. She took me because someone paid her to do it. I grabbed Daniel's phone and zoomed in on the document. The names were listed chronologically. Michael Chen, July 2000. Jessica Bailey, August 2001. Kevin Morrison, June 2002. Daniel Archer, July 2003. Beside each name was a date, a location, and a dollar amount. Below Daniel's entry were 4 more names I didn't recognize, spanning from 2004 to 2007. Then the ledger ended. 8 children over 7 years, I said. Whoever was running this operation stopped in 2007. Either they shut down or they moved to a different location. Daniel took his phone back, or they got caught and covered it up. That's what I'm afraid of. That some investigation happened that made them stop, but the people involved were never held accountable. That children were returned or sold and nobody ever connected the dots because the evidence was buried or destroyed. My father had his own phone out now. I'm calling Detective Morris. He was the lead investigator on Daniel's case. If there was a larger operation, if other departments were investigating similar disappearances, he would know about it. But when he dialed the number, the response he got made his face go rigid. He listened for a long moment, then hung up. Morris retired in 2008. The officer I spoke with said he moved to Costa Rica and hasn't been back to the States since. She couldn't provide a forwarding contact. Daniel laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Let me guess. He retired suddenly, bought property in a country with no extradition treaty, and nobody thought that was suspicious. He pulled up something else on his phone. I've been researching this for 6 months. Every adult involved in these disappearances either died, moved out of the country, or disappeared themselves within 3 years of the last incident. Brian Shepard died in a boating accident in 2009. The camp director, Robert Thorne, had a fatal heart attack in 2010. The assistant director, Margaret Liu, moved to Thailand in 2008, and Detective Morris, who investigated at least 3 of these cases, retired to Costa Rica with enough money to buy a beachfront villa at age 49. My mother had gone very still. "You're saying the police were involved? That Detective Morris was part of this?" Daniel met her eyes. "I'm saying he investigated 3 missing children cases over 5 years, never found any of them, never connected the cases, and then retired wealthy to a country where he can't be extradited if someone eventually figures out what he did. Yes, I think he was involved. I think he was paid to make sure these cases never went anywhere, to make sure grieving families like yours accepted that their children had drowned or wandered off and stopped asking questions." I felt something cold settling in my stomach. If the detective was compromised, if the camp staff were all in on it, then who was buying the children? Where did Daniel end up? Where did the others go? Daniel's expression darkened. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. Catherine kept me isolated. I was homeschooled, rarely left the house, had no friends. She told me it was because I was fragile, because of the trauma from losing my parents. But now, I think it was because she was afraid someone would recognize me, or maybe because whoever paid her wanted it that way. She called someone every few months, always when she thought I was asleep. I would hear her talking in low tones about how I was doing, whether I seemed to remember anything, giving progress reports to someone. Do you remember anything specific from these calls?" I asked. "Any names or details?" Daniel closed his eyes, concentrating. She always called them Doctor. Never used a first or last name, just Doctor. She would say things like, "Doctor said we should move if he starts asking questions," or "Doctor thinks we should consider medication if the memories get stronger." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was talking to my therapist, except I didn't have a therapist. After she died, I searched her phone records. Most calls were normal: grocery store, bank, utility companies. But there was one number that appeared regularly. Every 2 to 3 months, always calls lasting 10 to 15 minutes. I tried calling it after Catherine died. It was disconnected. He opened his eyes. But I did some digging. The number was registered to a medical facility called North Pacific Children's Institute in Bellingham. I drove up there last month. The building is still there, but it's been abandoned for 15 years. Windows boarded up, foreclosure notices on the door. I broke in to look around. "What did you find?" My father's voice was tight. Daniel pulled out his phone again and showed us photographs: empty corridors with peeling paint, examination rooms with outdated equipment, and offices filled with filing cabinets. Most of the patient records were gone, removed professionally, not stolen randomly. But whoever cleaned the place out missed one cabinet in a storage room behind a false wall. I found files for 37 children admitted between 1998 and 2007. The files included medical histories, psychological evaluations, and something called integration protocols. The protocols detailed how to help children adjust to new families after traumatic separations from birth families, how to suppress memories, how to create new identities, how to prevent attachment to previous caregivers. He swiped through more photos. The institute was run by a psychiatrist named Dr. Julian Reeves. According to his credentials, he specialized in childhood trauma and memory reconstruction. But reading through these files, what he actually specialized in was taking stolen children and erasing their pasts so they could be placed with people who paid for them. My mother stood up abruptly and walked to the window. She stood there with her back to us, her shoulders shaking. My father went to her, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "How many?" she asked, without turning around. "How many children went through that facility?" Daniel looked at his phone. 37 children in the files I found, but those were just the ones in that one cabinet. If that was storage overflow, hidden behind a false wall, how many more were in the main filing system that was removed? How many other facilities like this were operating? How many children were taken and erased and sold to couples desperate enough to pay 6 figures for a child they could pretend was theirs? He looked at my parents. How many families like ours spent decades mourning children who were actually alive and living under different names with people who bought them? I had been processing all this information at a distance, like I was watching a movie instead of living through it. But now, something my mother said earlier clicked into place. You said one body was recovered from the other disappearances at the camps. Which case? My mother turned from the window. Her face was streaked with tears, but her expression had hardened into something determined. Jessica Bailey, August 2001 at Camp Riverside in Oregon. They found her body 3 days after she disappeared. The autopsy said drowning, but her family fought it. They claimed the injuries weren't consistent with drowning. There were bruises, marks that suggested restraint. The medical examiner stood by his findings, but the family hired an independent pathologist who said the death was suspicious. The police investigated briefly, then closed the case. The family tried to sue the camp, but their lawyer dropped the case suddenly, and they couldn't find another attorney willing to take it. She looked at Daniel. If your theory is right, if there was a trafficking operation, Jessica Bailey might have been killed when something went wrong. Maybe she resisted. Maybe she tried to escape. Maybe she was going to expose what was happening, so they killed her and made it look like a drowning to protect the operation. Daniel nodded slowly. That would explain why the ledger shows payment beside her name, but she was the only one who turned up dead. The others were successfully disappeared. She wasn't, so they had to contain the situation. He looked at me. I want to find Dr. Reeves. I want to find everyone involved in this operation who's still alive. And I want to find the other children. Some of them would be adults, now like me. Some might still be trapped with the families who bought them, not knowing their real identities. They deserve to know the truth. Their families deserve to know they're alive. My father cleared his throat. This isn't something we can investigate on our own. This involves kidnapping, trafficking, murder, police corruption, and a conspiracy spanning decades. We need to take everything you found to the FBI. Let them handle it. Daniel shook his head. The FBI had oversight of these cases. They were the ones who decided not to investigate further when families raised concerns. Either they were incompetent or they were compromised. I'm not trusting them until I know exactly how deep this goes. Then who do you trust? I asked. Daniel looked at me steadily. Right now, only you. You're the only person I'm certain wasn't involved, because you were 12 years old when this happened. Everyone else is suspect until proven otherwise. The weight of that statement settled over me. My brother, who I thought had been dead for 22 years, was sitting in my apartment asking me to help him expose a child trafficking conspiracy that might involve police, medical professionals, and federal investigators. It was insane. It was impossible. And looking at his face, at those eyes with the brown fleck in the left iris, I knew I was going to help him anyway. Okay, I said. Where do we start? Daniel smiled, and for the first time since he had appeared on my doorstep, it looked genuine. We start with finding someone from that camp who wasn't part of the conspiracy, someone who saw something suspicious and kept quiet out of fear or ignorance, someone who will talk now that enough time has passed. We spent the next 4 hours going through staff records from Silver Lake Youth Camp. Daniel had compiled a comprehensive list of every employee who worked there between 2000 and 2003, along with whatever current information he could find. Most had moved on to other jobs, other lives. Several were deceased, but 3 names stood out as possibles. Emma Fletcher, a junior counselor who had quit 2 weeks after Daniel's disappearance and never worked at a camp again. David Cruz, a maintenance worker who had been fired in late 2003 for undisclosed reasons. And Patricia Simmons, the camp nurse who had transferred to a hospital in Montana immediately after the season ended. Fletcher lives in Tacoma, Daniel said, pointing to her address on his laptop screen. She's a teacher now at an elementary school. No criminal record, no obvious red flags. But she quit right after I disappeared and specifically requested that she not be contacted as a reference for any future camp employment. That suggests she saw something she wanted to distance herself from. We drove to Tacoma the next morning. My parents wanted to come, but Daniel convinced them to stay behind in case we needed them to verify information or make calls. The drive took an hour through heavy morning traffic. Fletcher lived in a modest house in a residential neighborhood, the kind of place where people walked their dogs and kids rode bikes in the street. She answered the door in yoga pants and a sweatshirt, her graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked at Daniel, and her face went white. "Oh my God," she whispered. You're real. You're actually real. I thought I was going crazy all these years. She pulled us inside quickly, checking the street before closing the door. Her hands were shaking. I knew something was wrong that day. I knew it. But nobody would listen to me. They told me I was mistaken, that I was upset and confused by the tragedy. But I wasn't mistaken. I know what I saw. We sat in her living room while she made tea with trembling hands. When she finally sat down across from us, she looked at Daniel like he was a ghost. You have to understand, I was 19 years old. It was my first summer working at a real camp. I wanted to do well, to prove I could handle responsibility. So when Brian Shepard told me to keep quiet about what I saw, I listened. I was scared I would lose my job or get blamed somehow. I've regretted it every day since. She took a shaky breath. The morning you disappeared, I was walking past the lake on my way to the craft building. I saw Brian talking to a woman near the dock. She wasn't dressed like a parent or a camp visitor. She was wearing medical scrubs and she had a large canvas bag. They were speaking quietly, intensely. Then Brian saw me watching and his expression changed. He smiled and waved like nothing was wrong, but the woman picked up her bag quickly and walked toward the parking lot. I thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything because Brian was my supervisor, and I didn't want to cause trouble. What did the woman look like? Daniel leaned forward. Fletcher closed her eyes, remembering. 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark hair in a bun. Average height and build. Professional demeanor. The thing I remember most clearly was her bag. It was a medical supply bag, the kind nurses carry for home visits. I know because my mother was a visiting nurse and had the same style bag. It had medical equipment inside. I could see the corner of an oxygen tank, tubing, other supplies. At the time, I thought maybe someone had a medical emergency. But then later that afternoon, you went missing. And when they found the body, Brian was the one who identified it before your parents arrived. He seemed very certain it was you, even though the face was damaged. He wouldn't let anyone else look closely. He said it was too traumatic, that we should spare the other kids the sight. I remember thinking it was odd that he was so protective about it, so controlling of who saw what. Did you tell anyone about the woman with the medical bag? I asked. Fletcher nodded miserably. I told Detective Morris when he interviewed me 2 days later. I said I thought it was strange that a medical professional was at the camp that morning, that she and Brian seemed to be waiting for something. Morris wrote it down in his notebook and told me it was probably just a camp nurse making a supply delivery. But we already had a camp nurse, Patricia Simmons. And she didn't arrive until that afternoon because she had the morning shift at a hospital. So who was the woman I saw? I asked Morris that question. He told me I was probably confused about the timeline, that it was easy to mix up details after a traumatic event. He suggested I stop speculating and focus on healing. She looked at Daniel. I tried to convince myself he was right, that I was confused. But I wasn't. I know what I saw, and when I saw it. There was a woman with medical equipment at the camp the morning you disappeared. Brian Shepard was meeting with her, and 6 hours later you were supposedly dead. Daniel's expression had gone very cold. Did you see this woman again after that morning? Fletcher shook her head. Never. I looked for her during the investigation, thinking she might come back or be questioned, but she never appeared, and Brian acted like the conversation I witnessed never happened. When I tried to bring it up to him privately, he told me I was mistaken. He said I had seen Patricia arriving early and gotten confused. But Patricia drives a silver sedan. The woman I saw got into a white van with no windows in the back, a medical transport vehicle. I remember because I thought it looked like an ambulance without the markings. She set down her teacup. After you were declared dead and the camp closed for the season, I quit. I told the director I didn't want to return. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman and the medical bag and Brian's insistence that I had imagined it. I started having nightmares. I considered going to the police again, but I was terrified. What if I was wrong? What if I caused problems for innocent people? What if Brian or the detective or someone else decided I was a liability? She looked at me. So I stayed quiet. I became a teacher instead of pursuing camp work. I tried to forget. But I never did forget. And now you're sitting in my living room, alive, and I know I should have fought harder to tell the truth. We left Fletcher's house with more questions than answers. but also with concrete evidence that something criminal had happened at the camp. Daniel drove while I called Patricia Simmons's number. She answered on the second ring with a cautious hello. I explained that I was investigating the Daniel Archer case from 2003 and needed to ask her some questions. There was a long pause. I was wondering when someone would finally call about that, she said quietly. I've been waiting 22 years for this conversation. Are you with the police? I told her we were family members conducting a private investigation. Another pause. Good. I don't trust the police. Not after what happened. Can you come to Montana? I won't discuss this over the phone. We booked flights that afternoon and landed in Billings 6 hours later. Simmons met us at a coffee shop near the airport. She was in her 60s now, gray-haired and tired-looking, but her eyes were sharp and angry. I want to make something clear before we start, she said after we sat down. I didn't know what was happening at the time. I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't have proof, and I didn't know who to trust. By the time I figured out what they were doing, it was too late to stop it without implicating myself. So I ran. I transferred to Montana and spent 2 decades looking over my shoulder, waiting for someone to come after me for what I knew. She looked at Daniel. You're Daniel Archer. I can see it in your face. You look like your mother around the eyes. I'm glad you're alive. When I heard they had found a body, I knew immediately it was wrong. The timeline didn't work. But nobody wanted to listen. She pulled out a worn notebook from her bag. I kept records. Everything I saw, everyone who seemed suspicious, all the inconsistencies that bothered me. I knew someday someone would ask questions, and I wanted to be ready. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a sticky note. The day Daniel disappeared, I wasn't scheduled to arrive at camp until 2 in the afternoon. I had the morning shift at Tacoma General Hospital, got off at noon, drove to the camp. I arrived at 1:45. The emergency call about Daniel going missing didn't come until 2:30. But when I got there, Brian Shepard was already in full crisis mode. He had organized search teams, contacted the police, set up a command center in the main office, all within 45 minutes of me arriving, supposedly 15 minutes after Daniel was first reported missing. That level of organization takes longer than 15 minutes. It felt rehearsed. She flipped a page. I asked Brian when Daniel had last been seen. He said approximately 2:15 during free swim period. But I had passed the lake at 1:50 on my way to the nurse's office. There were no children swimming. The lake was empty except for one person in the water near the far dock. I didn't think anything of it at the time because it wasn't unusual for staff to swim during off hours. But now looking back, if Daniel went missing at 2:15 and Brian already had a full search operation running by 2:30, someone must have noticed he was gone almost immediately, which means someone was watching him specifically. Daniel had gone very still. You saw someone in the water at 1:50? Who was it? Simmons met his eyes. I couldn't see clearly from the road, but the person was adult-sized and swimming strongly toward the far shore where the forest meets the waterline, away from the camp, like they were meeting someone in the trees. She tapped her notebook. The other thing that bothered me was the body. When the divers brought it up 6 hours later, Brian insisted on identifying it immediately. He wouldn't let anyone else approach. The police went along with it because he was the supervising counselor, and they assumed he knew the children well enough to make a positive identification. But I had been the camp nurse for 3 summers. I knew every child's medical file. I knew Daniel had a birthmark on his left shoulder blade, roughly 2 inches in diameter, shaped like a butterfly. His mother had mentioned it during intake as an identifying feature. When they brought the body into the camp medical building for me to prepare for transport, I checked for the birthmark. It wasn't there. She closed the notebook with a sharp snap. I told Detective Morris. I showed him Daniel's medical file with the birthmark documented. He told me water damage and decomposition could cause birthmarks to fade or become unrecognizable. But I'm a nurse. I understand decomposition. That body had only been in the water 6 hours in relatively cold lake water. There should have been minimal tissue damage. The birthmark should have been visible. What happened when you pushed back? I asked. Simmons's mouth formed a thin line. Morris told me I was overwrought, that I was looking for problems where none existed because I felt guilty about not being there when Daniel went missing. He suggested I take some time off. Then the camp director called me into his office, Robert Thorne. He told me the camp's insurance company was concerned about liability, that any suggestion the body wasn't Daniel's could complicate matters. He said it would be best for everyone if I accepted the identification and moved on. He offered me a bonus, $5,000 for my trouble. I refused it. 2 days later, I was informed that budget cuts meant the camp couldn't afford a full-time nurse anymore, and my position was being eliminated. She smiled bitterly. I had already accepted a job offer in Montana by then. I knew what was happening. I knew they were silencing me, so I left before they could do worse. Daniel spread the photographs from Catherine's house on the table, the ledger pages, the medical facility files, the documentation of payments. "Did you know Catherine Ward?" he asked. Simmons studied the photos. "Not personally, but I remember a woman matching that description coming to the camp 3 or 4 times that summer. She always arrived alone, spoke to Brian or Robert, then left. She carried a medical bag. I thought she might be a consultant or a specialist of some kind. But nobody introduced us, even though I was the camp's medical professional. She and Brian seemed familiar with each other, comfortable, like they had worked together before." She picked up one of the photos showing the North Pacific Children's Institute. "I've never seen this facility, but the name sounds familiar. I think Robert Thorne mentioned it once during a staff meeting. He said the camp had a partnership with a Children's Medical Research Institute that was studying the long-term effects of outdoor education on child development. He asked us to report any children who seemed particularly stressed or traumatized by the camp experience, because the institute wanted to follow up with therapeutic support. I thought it was progressive and caring at the time. Now, I wonder what that follow-up actually involved." We spent 2 more hours with Simmons, documenting everything she remembered. She gave us her notebook and copies of Daniel's medical file showing the butterfly birthmark. She also provided contact information for 2 other former staff members who had left Silver Lake Youth Camp under suspicious circumstances. "Find them," she said, as we prepared to leave. "Find everyone who saw something and was told to keep quiet. Find the children who were taken. And make sure everyone involved in this goes to prison. I've lived with this guilt for 22 years. I want to see justice before I die." Daniel promised her we would. On the flight back to Seattle, he was silent, staring out the window at the clouds below. Finally, he said, "We have enough now. We have witness testimony. Medical records showing the body wasn't mine, documentation of payments, and a medical facility involved in erasing children's identities. We can go to the FBI." I shook my head. "We're still missing the most important piece. We know what happened, but we don't know who gave the orders, who ran the operation, who paid for the children. Dr. Reeves is the key. If we can find him, we can trace the money back to whoever was buying these kids." Daniel pulled out his phone. "I've been trying to track Reeves for months. He disappeared in 2007, right after the institute closed. No forwarding address, no current medical license, no social media presence. But I did find something interesting. His wife, Margaret Reeves, is still alive. She lives in Portland and works as a real estate agent. I found her listing on a property website. She uses her maiden name now, Margaret Holloway. I tried calling her 6 weeks ago, but she hung up as soon as I mentioned Julian. Maybe if we approach her in person, she'll talk." We drove to Portland the next day. Margaret Holloway's real estate office was in a modern building downtown. She was meeting with a client when we arrived, a well-dressed woman in her 50s with professional makeup and carefully styled hair. When she saw Daniel waiting in the lobby, her expression flickered with something that might have been recognition or fear. She finished her meeting quickly and gestured us into her private office. "I don't know who you are or what you want," she said before we could introduce ourselves. "But if this is about Julian, I can't help you. We divorced 15 years ago. I haven't spoken to him since. I don't know where he is, and I don't care." Daniel placed the photograph of himself as an 8-year-old on her desk. "I'm Daniel Archer. I was taken from Silver Lake Youth Camp in 2003 and processed through your husband's facility. My identity was erased. I was given to a woman who paid your husband to provide her with a stolen child. I want to know where he is and who else was involved in the operation. And I want to know where the other children ended up." Margaret stared at the photograph. Her carefully composed professional mask cracked. "Oh God. I knew some of it. I suspected more. But I told myself I was wrong, that Julian wouldn't do something so terrible. I wanted to believe he was helping traumatized children, that the institute was legitimate. She looked up at Daniel. You were real. You were actually one of them. I convinced myself they didn't exist. She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. Julian called it the Sanctuary Project. He said he was helping children who had been removed from dangerous situations but couldn't go through traditional foster systems because of legal complications. He said he was providing them with stable homes and new identities so they could escape their pasts. I believed him because I wanted to. Because the alternative was that my husband was involved in something monstrous, and I couldn't accept that about someone I loved. She turned back to face us. But over the years, I started seeing inconsistencies. The children he worked with were never visible. There were no public records, no oversight, no other medical professionals involved. Just Julian and a small group of people he trusted. When I asked questions, he became defensive. He said the work was sensitive, that exposure would endanger the children. He made me feel guilty for doubting him. So I stopped asking. She sat back down. Then in 2007, everything ended abruptly. Julian closed the institute, destroyed the records, and disappeared. He told me he was going overseas for a medical conference and would be back in 2 weeks. That was 15 years ago. I haven't seen or heard from him since. Did he leave any indication where he was going? I asked. Any contacts, addresses, anything? Margaret opened a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. This arrived 3 months after he left. No return address, postmarked from Ecuador. Inside was a cashier's check for $2 million and a note saying he was sorry for everything, that I should use the money to start a new life, and that I should never try to find him. I deposited the check. I divorced him in absentia. I changed my name back to Holloway and tried to forget I was ever married to Julian Reeves. She handed the envelope to Daniel. But I kept this because I knew someday someone would come asking questions. I knew what he did would eventually catch up to him. If you find Julian, tell him I hope he rots in hell for what he did to those children, for what he did to families like yours. We left Portland with the postmarked envelope and a growing list of evidence. Daniel was quiet during the drive back, processing everything we had learned. Finally, he said, Ecuador doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. If Reeves is there, we can't touch him legally. But we can expose what he did. We can make sure everyone knows about the Sanctuary Project and the children who were stolen. We can find the other victims and give them back their identities. I agreed. We spent the next 3 weeks compiling everything into a comprehensive report. Witness statements from Fletcher and Simmons. Medical records showing the body wasn't Daniel. Financial records showing payments to Catherine Ward. Photos and documents from the North Pacific Children's Institute. The ledger listing 8 children and their sale prices. Margaret Reeves's testimony about the Sanctuary Project. We added contact information for the families of the other missing children listed in the ledger. Families who might still be searching for answers. Then Daniel did something I didn't expect. He contacted an investigative journalist named Rachel Morris, who had built a career exposing institutional corruption. He sent her everything we had compiled and asked her to investigate. Why not go to the FBI? I asked. We have enough evidence now. Daniel shook his head. Because the FBI might bury it again. But if this goes public, if a major news organization publishes a comprehensive investigation, they won't be able to ignore it. The pressure will force them to act. And if there are other children still out there living under false identities, the publicity might reach them. They might recognize details from their own past and realize they were stolen too. Morris called us 2 days later. She had spent 48 hours verifying our documentation and conducting her own interviews. This is real, she said. This is a major trafficking operation involving police corruption, medical fraud, and institutional cover-up spanning decades. I want to run this as a multi-part series, but I need you both on record. Full names, faces, testimonies. Are you willing? Daniel looked at me. I thought about my brother, who had been dead for 22 years and was now alive, sitting in my apartment, asking me to help him expose the people who had stolen his childhood. I thought about the other children on that ledger who might never know their real names unless someone fought for them. I thought about the families still mourning children who might be alive. Yes, I said. We're willing. The first article published 3 weeks later. It was titled, The Sanctuary Project. how a child trafficking ring operated in plain sight for nearly a decade. Within hours, it had gone viral. The FBI issued a statement saying they were opening an investigation. 3 days later, Detective Morris was arrested in Costa Rica on an international warrant. Margaret Liu was found in Thailand and extradited. Robert Thorne's estate was sued by 7 families of missing children. But the real impact came from the children themselves. Daniel's story, complete with photographs and documentation, reached someone in Toronto. A man named Michael Chen, who had always felt disconnected from his past, who had fragments of memories that didn't match what his parents told him about his childhood. He contacted the journalist and said the details in Daniel's case matched his own experience. He had been raised by parents who claimed to adopt him legally from China, but he had memories of speaking English as a child, of living near a lake, of a brother named James. DNA testing confirmed he was the Michael Chen listed in the ledger from July 2000. His real family was found in Oregon. They had spent 24 years believing he drowned at camp. 2 weeks later, another match. A woman in Calgary who had been adopted as a 6-year-old and had always questioned her origin story. She recognized details about a summer camp from the article. DNA confirmed she was one of the children from the ledger. Then another, and another. Over the next 6 months, 5 of the 8 children from the ledger were identified and reunited with their birth families. 2 remained missing. 1 was confirmed deceased. The Jessica Bailey whose body had been found and whose family had fought for justice. The FBI investigation expanded to include dozens of cases across multiple states. They discovered 4 other medical facilities similar to the North Pacific Children's Institute, all run by associates of Dr. Julian Reeves. They found evidence of a network that had operated for nearly 15 years, trafficking children to wealthy couples who couldn't or wouldn't adopt through legal channels. Hundreds of children might have been processed through the system. Some were identified and returned to their families. Others remained lost, their identities erased so thoroughly that even they didn't know who they had been. Dr. Julian Reeves was never found. The FBI tracked him to Ecuador, then to Brazil, then the trail went cold. He became one of the most wanted men in America, but he remained free, somewhere in the world, living on money he had earned from selling stolen children. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. Daniel and I stood in our parents' backyard on a sunny afternoon in October, exactly 1 year after he had knocked on my door. Our mother was inside preparing dinner. Our father was grilling salmon on the deck. It looked almost normal except for everything that had changed. Daniel had legally reclaimed his identity. He had moved to Seattle and taken a job as an advocate for trafficking victims, using his experience to help others navigate the trauma of recovered identity. The families of the children we had found had formed a support network, helping each other process decades of grief and the complex reality of reunification. Some of the reunions were joyful, others were painful. All were complicated. "Do you ever regret coming back?" I asked Daniel. "Would it have been easier to stay Thomas Ward and never know the truth?" He thought about it for a long moment. Easier? Maybe. But I would have spent my whole life feeling incomplete, feeling like something was missing. Now I know what was missing. I know who I am. I know what happened to me. I can't get back the 22 years they stole, but I got back my name. I got back my family. And I helped other people get back theirs too. That's worth more than easy. We had dinner together that night, the 4 of us around the table like a normal family, except we all knew we weren't normal anymore and never would be. We had been broken and partially repaired. There were gaps that would never fully close, damage that would never completely heal. Daniel told stories about the years he couldn't remember, trying to reconstruct a childhood that had been erased. My parents listened and filled in details about the son they had thought they buried. I watched them all and felt grateful and angry simultaneously. Grateful that Daniel was alive, that we had found the truth, that some justice had been served. Angry that it had happened at all, that it had taken so long to expose, that Dr. Reeves was still free somewhere. But mostly I felt something else. Determination. Because even though we had found some answers and helped some families, there were still children out there who didn't know their real names. Still families searching for children who might be alive. Still pieces of the Sanctuary Project that remained hidden. And I was going to help find them. Daniel had given me back a brother I thought I had lost. Now we were going to give other families the same gift. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.